F is for flash. Flash is material left after the casting process. Flash is excrescence of material from the cast. Flash is usually removed. Flashing is the fleshy growth of plaster or resin or plastic beyond its expected confines. Flash is the accidental. Flashing is not the instrument. Flashing is the words that grow in the gaps. Where the air bubbles were, that's flash. It roughens the concaves. It's like stippling, but it's not stippling. Stippling is deliberate, it's a technique, and flashing is not. Flashing happens. Flashing happens when you try to relive a piece of writing. It's a fleshy thing produced by hand and memory and air. They call it a witness mark, the line of flash. Sometimes they say, with such precise geometries that it is almost impossible to create a perfect fit. Flashing is about surfaces, about the interchange between hearing and seeing, about the abandonment of sculpture and what happens when they say it's impossible to create a perfect fit. The edges of flashing can be trimmed with a blade or an abrasive surface. It depends on the material, which might be bronze, brass, plaster, clay, words, wax, or resin. De-flashing leaves witness marks. I cut my hand on it. You can use pressure-sensitive paper to check the pressure on the parting line while the tool is in the press. I've checked the pressure in the flash areas and the non-flash areas, and still I can't find my baby. Flashing is the fleshy growth around the esophagus, or something like the skin tags of the voice, as recalled in the hand and inner ear. On the pressure-sensitive paper. In the end of sculpture as a reflective surface. M is for Myra Schendel's Monotypes, which I went to see not long ago at Hauser and Worth. The gallery's on Savile Row, and it was early on a Saturday. That was Bill Nighy, my partner said as we crossed the road, but there are so many people who look like Bill Nighy around there that I wasn't convinced. The Monotypes were laid out flat on waist-high plinths right by the windows. They were tearing up the road outside, and one of the road workers kept on looking at us, looking at the prints. I caught his eye occasionally, and I thought that he looked like he was going to come in and take a look himself, and I wondered if the gallery people would let him in with his work boots on. I didn't really see Bill Nighy, but I think he was probably wearing a navy cashmere overcoat that contrasted in a tasteful way to his, quote, silver hair. The prints are over half a century old, and Schendel made them by tracing across small sheets of Japanese paper laid out over rolled black oil paint. Where she pressed into the paper, it picked up the ink irreversibly. Now the lines she traced have a dark nimbus, a hiss, which I think wasn't deliberate, which I think was an accident of the pure interaction of fibre and oil. I say hiss because when I think of Schendel's Monotypes, I think of sound and the act of translation between the sounded and the seen. I've always wanted to treat these unlikely, minimal objects as scores, actually. These intense but fragile and unvociferous prints are part of a noisy world, a part of what the Brazilian concrete poets call the verbivoco-visual system, an ecosystem, really. But if they are scores, do they preserve or distort or transform material as they move it from state to state? I don't know if they do. Does a score need to have an object? Does it need to score something? Is it possible to have a sort of intransitive score? Because actually, that's what the prints seem to suggest, the wordless ones, I mean. Hans-Jörg Reinberger, writing about virology research, described an experimental system that was, in a sense, oscillating around an epistemic thing that constantly escaped fixation. In a similar way, whatever these prints score also seems to escape fixation, is never quite specifiable as such. There's a kind of seismic quality to these monotypes, and I think that connects to the way they oscillate around their objects. The way something vibratory is not a thing, but a relationship. Outside, they started drilling the tarmac again, using a mini-cap with a pneumatic attachment. We could all feel it through the dark concrete floor. If we observe a pile of books hanging in the air, we might say they must be resting on something. He stood leaning against the bulkhead, hands resting on the cabin top. Safe in the kitchen, he shouted at Mariana that her grandfather was resting. He was lying clothed on his back, legs apart, elbows resting in the snow, with his arms inexplicably pointing straight upwards, ending with contorted blue fingers like a pair of old gnarled trees. Resting in Regam. Above these is an intermediate breakdown zone resting on the sands and related to a major roof collapse, followed by several bedded sequences of breccias in which most of the fossils occur. The discovery of more stable chemicals, Table 3, the true residual insecticides, which were sprayed onto the walls and roofs of dwellings and left a deposit that was lethal to mosquitoes resting on it for many weeks and even months, produced the ideal control that did not demand an impossibly high efficiency. It is not hard to see what Comrade Preobrazhensky's mistake here is resting upon. Upon his return, he settled at last under the protection of Cuthbert, first in the saint's own resting place at Durham, then in a hermitage under the protection of Durham Cathedral Priory at Finchdale by the River Wear, and the rest of his life is filled with his prayers and visions and miracles at Finchdale. That, then, clears up the mystery of Mr. McVitie. No doubt the final resting place of Mr. Lambrianu's kneecaps will come to light shortly. When she died a couple of years later, he was so heartbroken that he made sure he would share her final resting place at the Downs Crematorium in Bear Road when he too was laid to rest. It requires a resting period during winter. In Drenthe, feeling more than ever the despised outcast, he found consolation in a human resting place. The young woman, suitcase resting on the doorstep, said good afternoon. Is the HMI's interpretation, resting as it does on the claim that teachers' possession of knowledge and expertise provides the basis for their classroom confidence, the only possible one? In this, he was to be sadly mistaken, and the collapse of his position in the face of what was initially little more than a putsch organised by the Queen shows how shallowly based his authority was, resting on fear and coercion rather than genuine loyalty. We drank tea, and very often I would arrive some 5 to 10 minutes earlier than the appointed time, so the maid would tell me that I was to wait as Madame was still resting. From one angle, it could be merely resting, yet from another, the crushed corpse seems to sum up man's relationship with flies perfectly. They assemble offshore and then begin to battle their way up the rivers, fighting and dodging the swift downward current, selecting, with the help of the pressure-sensitive pores of their lateral lines, the reaches where the current is marginally slack, resting in quiet pools, recovering their strength before tackling another stretch of rapids. L is for language between language. There's a scene in Pasolini's Canterbury Tales when Ninetto Davoli has been put in the stocks. He looks straight into the camera, his head caught between the jaws of the wood, and he sings a song. Its words are in a language between languages, and seem to be mislearned by heart, by ear, the way songs are learned as a child. Who put the colours in the rainbow? It surely can't be Charles. Then, when the song moves into the refrain, and the camera cuts to a woman ringing a handbell and a man puffing on the bagpipes, Davoli's voice continues, breaking into a language beyond language, open vowel song. There was a young Gina, ole dooley, living in the town, Palapuri. When this young singer repete pour de musique, and this was all they tutti di complay. Ay, ay.